Stanford University.
Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth in our series of lectures on classical culture and art in honor of Lorenz Eitner. I'm Richard Martin. I'm the chair this year of the Classics Department. And before the introduction of our speaker this evening, it's proper to say a few words about the man for whom this series of lectures is named. The late Lorenz Eitner was Osgood Hooker Professor Emeritus of Fine Arts at Stanford. He was born in the Czech Republic to Austrian parents, spent his early years in Germany, and then immigrated at the age of 16 to South Carolina. He attended Duke University in North Carolina, graduating summa cum laude in 1940. During World War II, like so many other academics, he served in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, as an intelligence officer, and ended up at Nuremberg in the Office of the Chief of Prosecution after World War II. In 1946, he married Trudy von Kathrein, who herself had served in the Austrian resistance. And on his return to the United States, Eitner undertook graduate studies in art history at Princeton University with Kurt Weitzman and others. He received his PhD in 1952. His long and fruitful association with Stanford began in 1963 when he was called from his position in Minnesota to chair the Department of Art and Architecture here. And the job included at that time, without additional compensation, the task of overseeing the administration of the Stanford Museum, as it was then called. At that time, the museum was less concentrated on art, or perhaps more trendily postmodern than anyone could ever have imagined, because its collections included, at that time, such material culture objects as a railroad car and a shark head embalmed in glass, the latter acquired before Damien Hirst was even born. Eitner refocused the museum, increased the space more than tenfold, refurbished the galleries, acquired important drawings and paintings, and largely made the Cantor Center, as it's now called, what it is today. He also oversaw completion of the Cummings Art Building and built up the art history department through a number of world-class appointments. His own research on European Romantic paintings gained international recognition with many books and articles, especially his work on Géricault. For 25 years, until his retirement from the university in 1989, Eitner chaired the art department. I gulp every time I see figures like that. I only have to do it for another 4 months. Even then, he continued to lead an active scholarly life up to the day of his death, his family say, which occurred in March 2009. He was writing, corresponding, and being asked to authenticate paintings for dealers. While he's remembered with admiration as a scholar and administrator and entrepreneur, Eitner touched even more souls as a teacher. Sven Brunten, who was a former assistant director of the Stanford Art Museum, recalled at the time of Lorenz Eitner's death that, quote, he was a magnificent teacher who would have 200 to 250 students in his Art 1 class. His art scholarship combined a universality of thinking with great taste in connoisseurship. Brunchen continues, he loved art and objects and always carried Greek coins in his pocket so he could discuss them with anyone who was interested. He was not your normal university professor, unquote. I want to add that Eitner, whom I had the pleasure to meet once at the first lecture named for him, had not just a passion for fine art, but a love of literature, of humanities, of all of the things that help us preserve our humanness, of the past, and of creative ways of bringing it to the present. The Department of Classics, I'd like to think, also helps to foster such loves, and we too, in these days of presentism, of adulation of the merely technical and the mercantile, would like to follow Eitner's example and to be not your normal university professors. It was this spirit that we set out 6 years ago to commemorate in the Eitner Lectures. They came about through the inspiration and the essential support of Peter and Lindsay Joost, and I'm pleased to be able to acknowledge them once again this evening. They're with us. Acknowledge them for their splendid foresight and commitment. And our speaker tonight joins a long line, or, well, longer line of internationally renowned scholars who've lectured under the Eitner aegis on the values and problematics addressed by classical culture. So now it's my pleasure to turn over the podium to my colleague in classics and the chair of the Department of Political Science, Josh Ober, who will introduce our speakers.
John Ma burst onto the world stage in the field of classics with his first published article. Entitled Black Hunter Variations, it was ostensibly about the enigmatic figure of Damon of Cheironea, an obscure Boeotian opponent of Rome who appears only briefly in Plutarch's Life of Cimon. John's article won the 1994 John J. Winkler Memorial Prize, an award named, as many of you know, for one of Stanford's greatest and most deeply missed scholars. Black Hunter Variations had three parts. The first part was written in French, in the idiom of the dazzling post-structuralist hermeneutics of Pierre Vidal-Naquet. The second, in English, took the form of a learned historical commentary. Classicists will think of A.W. Gaume or Simon Hornblower, who was also John's teacher, Thucydides. The third part, again in English, was a soul-searching meditation on these two very influential traditions of classical scholarship, asking, in essence, what can a poor boy do if he is equally attracted by both Oxford and Paris? The article's unusual combination of profound erudition with shrewd wit obviously appealed to the Winkler Prize judges, as I imagine did the importance of the question he posed for his readers. Will one interpretive approach gain global hegemony among classical scholars? Will the field just self-destruct in an orgy of hermeneutical civil war? Or will contemporary classicists find a third way, gaining inspiration from a fusion of intellectual traditions? John Ma's brilliant career gives us hope for this dynamic, hybrid third way. I first met John Ma a few years before his Black Hunter Variations, when he arrived in Princeton after having achieved a starred first in Greats from Oxford. He came as a graduate student. It was for me a glorious year and a half of vibrant conversations. John was, from our very first meeting, not my student, but my colleague, and I think everyone who has taught John has had the same feeling, or who has ostensibly taught him has had exactly the same feeling. I know Fergus Miller did, because I've talked with him about that. All too soon, John returned to Oxford to take up a 7-year prize fellowship at All Souls College. The result was a magnificent first book, Antiochus III and the Cities of Western Asia Minor. Here it is. Read it, buy it. The result, the book's sober title and its lengthy technical epigraphical dossier might lead one to conclude that Oxford, to which he had returned after all, had won the battle for his soul as well as for his presence, and that the spirit of Vidal-Naquet had been spurned. Not so. Antiochus and the Cities was a complete rethinking of Hellenistic history based on the premise that we, scholars, had never properly appreciated the interdependencies structuring relationships between monarchs and cities, nor had previous scholars recognized that those relationships, those interdependencies, could be traced in depth and detail by a close reading of what had always been thought of as rather drably formulaic inscriptions. The core of the book redefines the very notion of Hellenistic empire by analyzing its deeper social and political structures and by probing its ontology in social interaction and practices. And so Paris was very well represented in this book, the Paris of Vidal-Naquet, but also of the great epigrapher Louis Robert and his successors, as was the Oxford of Fergus Miller and Oswin Murray and other luminaries. Moreover, John's already capacious intellectual geography had expanded remarkably. Paris and Oxford had already made way for Munich, for Istanbul, for Athens, and I dare say perhaps even at least a little corner for Princeton. The book is a tour de force of historical interpretation, conceptually challenging and grounded in a complete mastery of the ancient sources. It has set a new standard for scholarship on Hellenistic Greek history. After a brief return to Princeton as an assistant professor and a bicentennial preceptor, that's a very grand title in Princeton language that we don't speak around here, so I have to interpret. After his brief return to Princeton, John headed back to Oxford once again to take up his current position as lecturer and now tutor at Corpus Christi College, long one of the world's premier centers of classical studies. But you will not be by now surprised to hear that Oxford has had to share John's presence with Paris, where he has held various academic visiting positions, nor that John and his family now spend much of their time in Athens. In his recent scholarship, John Ma has continued to amaze us with his capacity to bring diverse scholarly traditions into vibrant harmony, even while deepening and extending his historical ambit. In an article in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, for example, John returned to Damon's hometown of Chaironeia, employing forensic analysis of skeletal remains from two mass graves to shed new light on the great lion statue that is now Chaironeia's most famous monument, and on the motives and the moral psychology of those who erected the monument and those who have viewed it across the ages. The turn to archaeological and iconographic studies is related to a much anticipated book in progress, a major rethinking of the role of honorific statues in the political culture of Hellenistic Greek cities. Among John's many other projects is analyzing Aramaic documents from the Persian Empire with the goal of coming to grips with the relationship between economies and relations of power in the Achaemenid Empire. Some of us had the pleasure of having some of the first fruits of that project in a seminar on Monday. Throughout all of his work, there is a strong common theme, and that I think is that if we really truly master enough tools, if we sufficiently master diverse interpretive approaches, then we can decipher the arcane record of antiquity, its words, its images, and its material remains. And this means that we can come to understand, even if imperfectly, the motivations and the passions that produced and sustained the societies of antiquity. We can do this, John Ma tells us, and we should, because what we can learn from the past has a great deal to tell us about ourselves. Well, I regret that I cannot take the time to tell you about more of John's exploits. I cannot recount how the most brilliant Latin inaugural speech in the recent history of All Souls pilloried an obstreperous college official, nor can I relate the itinerary of his solo bicycle trip across Western Turkey, tracing the epigraphic path of the great Louis Robert. I must leave you to imagine for yourselves the reenacted hoplite battles on the playing fields of Princeton. You really should have been there. I cannot share with you the pleasure of joining in John's experimental immersion in the techniques of ancient slingers. But what I can do is to invite you to join me in welcoming John Ma to Stanford University to offer the 2011 Lorenz Eitner Lecture on the topic Polis, the Greek city-state, 800 BC to AD 600. John Ma.
I suppose it is an interesting experience to have one's life just flashing before his eyes in that way. Thank you for that. And I should just say that one of the great joys of the last 20 years has been seeing the many great things that Josh has come up with in a constantly intriguing mix of consistency and consistency about what mattered and innovations in finding ways of understanding it. I would like to thank the Classics Department at Stanford for this invitation to give the Lorenz Eitner Lecture, and for its lavish hospitality, extended in fact to my whole family. I've had several days in which to have really great conversations with members of this department. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces, especially from New Jersey. In fact, some veterans of hoplite battles, I believe, on the Poe Field. And it's a very great honor to speak in Stanford, one of the dynamite departments in this country, the dynamite classics departments. But of course, it's a very daunting honor. In my particular field, ancient Greek history, Stanford was home to two giants, Tony Raubitschek and Michael Jameson, who worked on my particular field, or in my particular fields, Greek epigraphy and the historical geography of classical lands. I should say that right now, I have a large box of material from Michael Jameson's 50-year engagement with the island of Carpathos. I've had the occasion of admiring the integrity and wisdom of Michael Jameson's scholarship. Right now, Stanford is engaged in an amazing project, this cutting-edge new economic history, which weaves quantification and cultural history within a strong theoretical framework, a new sort of historicizing, and probably the next big thing. An ancient history based not on exemplification and fruity writing, but on quantification and argumentation deployed with a view towards explanation. This has been our holy grail for a long time. And this is another reason why speaking in this particular university is daunting. Another reason why this lecture is very challenging is that of having to speak on classics and why they are interesting and difficult to a wider audience, a form of public accountability to be welcomed. It's worth remembering that the great age of German philology and scholarship was also a great age of public lecturing, as a sign of the belief in the importance of classics. So I should thank those of you who came. I should thank my wife, Paraskivi, for talking to me about justice in Greece, ancient and modern, and trying to help me understand this issue, and more prosaically right now for actually holding our two children, age 6 and 3. I should thank some of my Oxford colleagues, Fergus Miller, Ben Gray, Peter Tonneman, and Mark Whittow, for teaching me a lot about the polis from archaic to late antique. And that is the last reason why this lecture is difficult. It's trying to talk about the polis across time, across all of classical history. What was a polis? I thought that was an easy question, in fact, until I came to Stanford and several of your graduate students came up to me and said, what actually is a polis? And grilled me, notably Donnie Wang and Mark Pizik. How do you define a polis? At one level, it's not a difficult question. It's a city-state. That is, it's a town at the center of a rural territory which it controls, hence a city. It's a political organization that runs itself through institutions, hence a state recognized by other such polities. It's a human community of citizens. All these definitions roll off our tongues easily. And we, of course, know that there were many polis throughout the history of the Greek ancient world. They ranged from the relatively large to the very small, from the very old to the very new, and they change throughout history. But of course, it's also a complicated question to answer, and it's the question I want to answer in this lecture. In what ways was the polis a city-state with specific characteristics which deserve to be explored at some length? So one such polis would be Priene in Asia Minor. Here's Priene for you. as it was in the mid-Hellenistic period around 150 BC. A very old city-state occupying a new plan set out in the 4th century BC, surrounded by a great fortification wall. Do I have a slide? Yes, I do. A great fortification wall defining the town itself, but also the Acropolis on top of the cliff above the site. The town, as you can see, is laid out as a grid. It covers a hillside. All north-south streets are stairways. Oops. Well, trust me, that is the case. It alternates between tightly packed private housing and expansive public spaces, the agora, the shrine of Athena, the theatre, the gymnasia. So here the memory hole, okay. Even now, this city of cut stone gives an impression of order and thoughtfulness in the exhausting rationality of the grid plan imposed on geographical elevation, in the unified texture of the stonework, in the proportion of the streets, in the abundant provision of public water whose overflow washes down the streets. Thoughtfulness and playfulness appear in the perfect ergonomic angle of the blocks of honorific front seating in the theatre, or the marble work on the retaining wall of the theatre, where the transition from rough, rusticated masses to polished surfaces occurs independently from the actual coursework of duly assembled and aligned blocks. This is the city as work of art. The beauty of Priene as a cultural assemblage reflects political choices, long-term, multi-generational investment in urban infrastructure as a project of pride and continuity. The urban fabric should be read politically. The distinction between private spaces and public spaces is crucial and structures the whole city. The housing units fitted within a strict grid hint at egalitarian pressures. The agora, the main public space, is separated from a smaller functional space where food trading takes place, and the agora itself is a ceremonial, representational, honorific space where the community recognizes good men, citizens or foreigners, by inscribing their names and by describing the decisions of the community to honor them, and by setting up their full-size portraits in bronze. The monuments you can see here constitute a thick series stretching across the agora in a striking materialization of a political culture of recognition. Ideology and history can literally be read in the vibrant public history which the Prienians have left in the form of a permanent state literature, their inscriptions on stone. These inscriptions show the community of citizens engaged in the political work of taking and implementing decisions, even if, or precisely because, the epigraphical habit is mainly devoted to honoring the worthy. This material gives us a vivid picture of what the Prienians thought mattered. They show the institutions of the city at work and the political principles behind the institutions: mass decision-making, collegiality, rotation, limits on executive power, accountability, and basic assumptions about the primacy of the public. Priene then lived its own, sometimes dramatic, often humdrum history as part of broader worlds, the regional networks of polis in Western Asia Minor, but also the whole system of similar communities across the Eastern Mediterranean, and as part of a broader story, the story of the Greek polis, which underwent evolutions and changes throughout its long continuous history, which spans all of classical ancient history, from the end of the Dark Ages, say 800 BC, to late antiquity, say AD 600. So the story of the polis takes place across all of ancient history, and the temptation is to map it out onto the traditional periods of ancient history in a model of birth, growth, and death. Archaic age, birth. Classical age, maturity. Hellenistic age, decline. Roman age, death. You can find this in any textbook. The model is not satisfactory, notably because the decline and death of the polis has proved difficult to pin down and exaggerated as the resolution of our historical gaze sharpens. Was the 4th century an age of decline after the pinnacle of the high classical age? No. Specialists of the 4th century point to a rich political culture in Athens and elsewhere. Did the Hellenistic period see the end of the polis? No. Hellenistic historians, especially those working on inscriptions, have vociferously defended the vitality of the Hellenistic polis. But did the Roman era see the end of the polis? No. More and more scholars see healthy civic practice and discourse. So we have a hot potato game. Change, decline, death of the polis, the death of the polis get passed down from period to period in a never-ending polis sort of game. Well, at least it must have ended at some point. The hot potato game brings out the possibility and the importance of a continuous history of the polis from the beginning to the end to try to make sense of the various phenomena which make up the polis. So this is what I'm going to try to do today, offer a continuous narrative of polis history from beginning to end, from soup to nuts, as Josh once told me when he encouraged me to try to do this. It's a personal narrative. It differs from the conventional narrative in periodizing the story a little bit differently across the traditional period boundaries between classical and Hellenistic. Well, the polis started somewhere at some point in time. What were there before? In Bronze Age Greece, at least in mainland southern Greece, we see a system based on the centralized extraction of surplus, its hoarding and disbursement within palatial systems of the type known from the ancient Near East. These polities disappear, this type of polities disappeared around 1200 BC. After a long and rather mysterious hiatus, what emerges is a hierarchical society of small-scale lordly polities, organized around big men, surrounded by smaller lords, bound to them by personal ties of obligation. The whole class is supported by the extraction of rent of producers. At least that is partly the image given by the main literary source, the early Greek epic poetry, which later generations attribute to a single poet called Homer. Richard, I hope that's acceptable. At the same time, Homeric epic shows the existence of communities made up of people sharing the same geographical setting of urban center and rural territory, and the same collective name. Communities bound by ties of solidarity in peace and war. The people meets in assembly, has institutions to resolve disputes, and a sense of the community as a whole. There are common sacrifices, common stores, common obligations. In other words, these early communities seem to know the distinction between public and private. Nestor asks Telemachus if he is traveling on public or private business. Demion, things for the people, or idion, things for himself, cognate to hetairos, the word of the private companion. There are many problems with reading the world of Achilles and Odysseus historically rather than as composite fantasies. Just to be quick about it, I believe that the Homeric epics are early, 730s rather than 670s, and that they reflect a historical society, the pre-polis that emerged out of Dark Age Greece, and that this historical society is reflected in the archaeology of the 8th century, which shows a number of simultaneous phenomena. Aristocratic burials, oh dear, believe me, there is an aristocratic burial in that black hole. Shared sacred spaces within urban sites, built up sacred spaces in the countryside, and so on. Phenomena visible, for instance, at Argos or at Eretria. On the urban site of the island of Naxos, aristocratic cities bury their dead in enclosures close to Mycenaean ruins. These enclosures then get built up and used for feasting by small groups, small aristocratic groups. The transition from pre-polis to archaic polis is marked by the end of these lordly societies of entrenched aristocracies probably claiming some form of natural right to rule embodied by descent, assuming that these aristocracies actually existed and are not a projection or idealization within epic poetry. The Archaic Polis sees the replacement of such aristocracies by competing elites, which put forward, ignore the people, just look at the large kouros there, competing elites which put forward rival claims to eminence before the community, claims whose performativeness has to be secured by community uptake, to use the technical but frankly rather obvious terminology of speech act theory. Community at the same time takes on sharper, more formalized lines such as institutional powers, judicial and administrative, in the form of elected office and bodies, written and public rules to govern procedure that concern everyone, the shaping and monumentalization of public spaces, sacred and profane, taxation, indirect and direct, and hence public resources which can be spent on public goods. In other words, we are dealing with an early and historically specific form of the state. These states act as nodes in a network, competing and interacting in a number of ways, peaceful and violent. And finally, strong normative statements about community emerge, centered on justice, restraint, the avoidance of greed, solidarity, and egalitarianism. Such features can be seen across a number of sites enacted on the ground. At Eretria and Naxos, where aristocratic family tombs are built over and turned into communal spaces. At Driros in Crete, which you have here on your plan, where the earliest known inscribed laws regulate by formally proclaimed and permanently publicized common decisions the sharing of powers between the constituent members of society within a postulate of a collective monopoly on performative utterance, i.e. of popular sovereignty. Here's the earliest Greek law, the so-called constitutional law from Driros. Thus it seemed good to the polis when a man, the first public inscription, the first attestation of polis, when a man has been cosmos, high officials, within 10 years, let him not be cosmos. If he acts as cosmos, whatever judgment he renders, let him pay double, and let him be akrestos, useless for his lifetime, and God accursed. And whatever he has done as cosmos, let it be nothing, sweareth of the oath, the cosmos and damioi, and the 20 of the city. The city can decide what is and what is not valid. It has the monopoly of the performative. The apparent unity of the archaic polis phenomenon should not obscure the presence of diversity, precisely as one of the characteristics of the archaic polis. All kinds of solutions are being developed and tried out. The archaic polis takes many forms, characteristic of an age of experiment and conflict. For instance, a conflict between countryside and town, known, for instance, in archaic Naxos. These forms also emerge against a background of economic developments in the archaic period, which still need, in fact, studying in detail. By the late archaic period, say the last quarter of the 6th century BC, certain traits seem to be dominant, though still contested. The principle of majority decision in assemblies, the consolidation of political and financial institutions of stateliness, the tentative acceptance of egalitarian ideologies of solidarity. These changes can be viewed and have been viewed as democratic, as instantiated in the institutions of the late archaic city, or, for instance, the patterns of burial in Metapontion in southern Italy. So the first democracies, to use Eric Robinson's phrase. Perhaps, as long as one bears in mind that this is the result of dynamic interaction between competitive elites and communitarian institutions, which emerge at the same time. The archaic polis and the polis has a mixed DNA from the start. So by the end of the 6th century BC, and the beginning of the 5th, the polis takes on a developed form which in the following 3.5 centuries will work out coherent directions of development in which major issues will be decided in a pretty uniform way. This is the Aristotelian polis, back to Priene, after Aristotle's Politics, whereas it's clear that Aristotle, like many writers of the classical period did not quite understand the diverse experimental histrionic politics of the Archaic period, the workings and issues of the polis from, say, 550 or 525 or 500 onwards are pretty familiar and intelligible to him. And the terms he uses and the values he privileges are recognizably those of the city-state after his time. This is the world of Hellenistic Priene. I will emphasize three issues during this long classical period. First, the development, diffusion, or convergence, which of the three remains to be determined, of civic institutions along direct, democratic, and participatory principles. After other principles, such as oligarchy or representative government, are either rejected or applied at other levels than that of the polis. In this long classical model, authority is embodied in the demos, the political community of citizens, meeting and decision-making assembly of all adult male citizens, in full political equality, and within a common political culture of publicity, accountability, and power sharing. This political culture can be seen at work most famously in democratic Athens, but also in a number of other places, many other places, Priene, Samos, Kos, or Delphi in the Hellenistic period. By the Hellenistic period, many or perhaps most polis, perhaps even all polis, are run as some form of demokratia. Second, polis culture involved the constant embedding of elites and elitism within polis norms as a consequence of postulates of political equality. Eliteness cannot be inherent or decided by peers, but is granted by community recognition, community honorific recognition, in return for services as a good citizen. Devotion to the community takes on the form of political and military service, but also a particular type of economic behavior, paying the taxes, the tele, that finance the public goods of civic life, providing such goods directly through formal institutions, the so-called liturgical system, and through voluntary gifts in return for honor, the euergetical system. This ethos of civic embeddedness produces a particular civic style of civic personhood, visible in the way in which personhood is represented in images or words. Conversely, individuals who do not fit these norms are reviled as tyrannical and antisocial. These are political discourses that reflect deeply held political values of justice and equality. Thirdly, the ideal of internal self-governance has consequences at the external level. How far does the political community have the power to decide? The issue here is that of freedom. Does any polis have the right to rule over other polis? What forms does a polis take when it's being ruled over by others? What margins of liberty will it find? The latter question is particularly important when a world of polis coexists with large supralocal imperial formations. The eventful political history of the classical period and the insistence of the Hellenistic polis that a demokratoumene polis, a city ruled by its demos, should be master of its own fate in some way, show how important freedom is for the Aristotelian polis. Freedom guarded by fortifications and by citizen soldiers. After 150 BC, all of these issues get resolved, but they don't quite get resolved in the way in which the citizens of the Aristotelian polis might have hoped. The twin aspects of demokratia, internal and external, come under pressure. First, because of social and cultural shifts within the polis itself. These shifts are very visible in Priene, for instance, in the long decrees for rich benefactors. The appearance of these very rich, very powerful super benefactors entail certain changes in the social makeup and the appearance of informal social hierarchies of a type unknown in the classical or the long classical polis. And secondly, because of the presence of a single overwhelming power with a strong integrative tendency, namely the Roman state. The Roman-era polis then seems to be an elitist organism with increasingly entrenched urban aristocracies, elites which have a stranglehold on office which is restricted to censitary criteria, and can be repeated or held for life. The council gains in power and in visibility. The Roman-era polis, with its hierarchies and its inequalities, seems like a ranked society. Heredity and family ties become important values which are proclaimed in the public sphere. If a bold suggestion of Susan Ayleshire and Stephen Lambert is correct, and if I've understood it, in fact, Roman-era Athens underwent a restrictive reform of its citizen body under the Emperor Augustus. The old aristocratic families, again, seem to have been at the center of this reform. In other words, a reversal of the inclusive reforms of the Cleistinic age, an anti-Cleistinic moment in Augustan Athens. More generally, we see members of the boule constituting a privileged social group, which modern historians call the curiales, from the Latin term. Their position is made visible notably in civic ritual and in pageantry. Rich citizens now perform benefactions on a massive scale, especially architectural benefactions. Their activity changes the appearance of the cities with architectural innovations such as the Great Bathhouse, the Fountain House, or the colonnaded avenue, the Plateia. To the extent that the late 2nd century traveller Pausanias expresses surprise that the small polis of Panopeus has none of the architectural amenities that one might expect from a polis. The Roman Empire is a great age of euergetism, the practice of gifts from the rich. The great benefactors are acclaimed by the communities as fathers, as nourishers, tropheus, or as the ocean itself, okeane, as the assembled people praise, that others might prove to be such trophes, nurturers of the people. The monuments of these civic aristocracies dominate public space. This is a phenomenon, the euergetical phenomenon, that can be interpreted as the legitimizing of social inequality in a form of pact, justifying elite rule. Or, in Paul Vane's subtle interpretation, it is in fact the expression of this inequality in a form of snobbishness. Yet Paul Vane also noticed and insisted on how euergetism in the Roman-era polis never lost its civic style. It prolonged this classical polis's embedding of eliteness through communitarian performance. The inscriptions on buildings record gifts by benefactors in sober terms that place emphasis on the community. The tone and emphasis are the same as those of the long classical polis, as well as the intention of publicity and the feeling for accountability. Building activity in the Roman-era polis represents a strong sense of collective identity. It gave the city the splendid appearance that embodied its destiny. It proclaimed the importance of shared spaces in an ideal of the good life. It allowed the polis to compete with its neighbors. This competition is visible in coinage and festivals, but also in local myth. Panopeus, the small Phocian city, did not have grand Roman-era buildings, but it was part of the age-old federation of Phocian cities. It had a history, and even more strikingly, it had myth. It was built next to the very clay bed where Deucalion had formed mankind after the flood. And Pausanias tells us that clay actually still smells of human flesh. Civic style was more than just the affirmation of collective identity. It took the form of civic politics. Eliteness is still decided in the Roman-era polis by the community in a fluid situation of negotiation. The arena for community decisions is still the assembly, whose role should not be downgraded. The assembly is important, is noted repeatedly by commentators as a locus of public oratory and public decision-making and of interaction between mass and elite. The prayer, the acclamation for the great nourishers of the city were also means of pressure to ensure redistribution, means of projecting social norms on members of the elite. And these moments of acclamation could easily turn into recrimination. Galen mentions a case of a civic notable who suffered or who faked a stomach ailment at the very idea of having to appear before an assembly where he was bound to come under informal pressure to undertake a liturgy, i.e. to undertake or to take on the onerous commitment of the provision of public goods out of his private pocket. Along with this practice of liturgies, many institutions from the Aristotelian age are attested, albeit sporadically, for the Roman period. Rotation of office, accountability, formal accountability in the form of rendering accounts, or simply the devoted involvement in the management of public funds and public goods in the institutions of public office. Now, the Roman state, as is well known, did encourage oligarchization. This occurred indirectly because an ever-increasing part of the activity of civic elites was to relate with the hegumenoi, the Roman leading masters, especially the emperor. And Michael Wörle has recently analyzed the oligarchizing processes at work in a decree from the city of Maronea. This decree gives a blank check, literally an eternally valid decree, to the civic elite for the latter to conduct embassies to the Roman emperor without needing to obtain popular assent. But the Roman state and its representatives also impacted directly on local political forms, as is attested in Bithynia and Lycia. So a process of encouraging eliteness in the Roman city that is well known, though somewhat argued over, and can be traced in various forms. But the Roman Empire also protected, certain features of polis life down to the 4th century BC. The Roman emperor was sympathetic to local culture. In rescripts, he protected public space against illegal private encroachment, often in responses to appeal by the polis themselves. The Roman Empire, most importantly, firmly insisted on the principle that private wealth entailed public obligations, not simply in the glamorous form of euergetes, but also in the semi-voluntary liturgies that burdened the wealth of the consular class. In other words, the Roman Empire favored or accelerated elitism, but also preserved the embedding of elites that was a central feature of civic life. The reason is that the Roman Empire depended on the existence of cities as administrative units and especially as fiscal units. The urban elites also acted as tax collectors for the Roman state of economic activities in the city, but especially in the countryside. By AD 400, the polis had started undergoing yet another set of changes that affected its central characteristics. The willingness of the wealthy to submit to redistributive practices within egalitarian institutions and ideologies finally ends with curial flight, completed by curial disengagement. The reluctance of the imperial state to allow its postholders to escape polis obligations, liturgies, finally breaks down, creating an avenue by which members of elites can disembed themselves from the local communities. This is curial flight. The result is to shift the burden on the remaining members of the consular class, which then basically refuse to play certain local games, curial disengagement. This class, the curial class, attested onto the 6th century AD, disengaged itself from the niceties of constitutional rule and abandons the various structures or facades of civic institutions that were a central part of the classical polis. In its stead comes a form of rule both more direct and more opaque and much more difficult to understand in the sources, more oligarchical. The so-called patriarchal rule by great families of landowners with, and not coincidentally, a concomitant rise in political violence by disenfranchised urban populations. This is also the moment when local mythology and cultural anchors for identity disappears. Local patriotism is replaced by an antiquarian but disengaged classical culture instead of the vibrant local patriotism embodied by mythology up to then. The rise of Christianity is yet another phenomenon that occurred at this moment as a source of a new source of personhood and of values, and also as a very concrete institutional form of power, namely the church, with a capital C, associated with the imperial state, but represented locally by a network of powerful bishops, which take on an increasingly important role in the local cities, but without taking over the values and discourses of the classical polis. The church and individual churches, for instance, become the recipients of benefactions rather than the city in the old style. The outcome of these changes can be seen in 6th century Egypt, when imperial fiscality no longer rests on the cities, but on great oikiai, great aristocratic houses, or in the 6th century rescript from, or edict from an imperial official who writes to, and I quote, the God-loving great and small landowners, present and future, of the city of the Hadrianopolitai in Paphlagonia. This edict is read out in the presence of the bishop, and it orders local landowners to refrain from keeping private armies, the xylocaballarioi, the spear riders. We see here big men in the countryside with private armies and their ambitions, and church authorities in town collaborating with the imperial state. But the classical polis itself is rather difficult to detect. Various other phenomena accompany this shift in polis culture and institutions as consequences or as accelerating factors. In the smaller cities, the erosion of public space and the rise of ostentatious palace building within cities. Another feature that vanishes is the link between urban center and rural territory, which was once structured through a complex hierarchy of settlement within polis structures, visible in classical Athens or in Roman era Lycia. What replaces it is the freeing of the countryside, which now it becomes a scene of intense building activity in great villages, villas or monasteries or churches in the countryside, which do not seem to be linked to and belong to any network of polis. This is the world of the monastery, the world of the Byzantine saint, moving from monastery to monastery rather than from polis to polis. Finally, civic finance disappears. It seems that civic assets, especially the civic estates, which produced rent for the cities, are confiscated, seem to have been confiscated by the imperial state. The income from local taxation and local invested endowments are just no longer present to finance the shared activities and spaces, the public goods that constituted the polis. Now, even in this period, you can detect various polis continuities and echoes. New polis do get created, and they're still called polis. For instance, the inhabitants of Didyma, which used to be a come, a dependency of Miletus, becomes a polis, the Justinianopolitai. The great provincial capitals, Aphrodisiac or Antioch, retain some form of monumental fabric, which is added to, but with deep changes. For instance, the mothballing of the honorific statue habit, to beg your pardon. Some features of old style euergetism are also taken over by the imperial officials or by certain bishops, combining civic discourse with Christian charity and concern for the afterlife. But the hot potato does stop somewhere. The polis does come to an end under a variety of pressures and evolutions. In some cases, simply because of invasion or insecurity, for instance, in Asia or in mainland Greece. Some places seem to keep cities going with a reduced curiosignatures, unaccountable oligarchical elites, and church authorities. This is a Seleukeia in the life of, or the miracles of Thecla, or the Thessaloniki of the early versions of miracles of Saint Demetrios. So continuities, but continuities of what? In the end, we get a city without the church as proponent or recipient of euergetism, without imperial subsidies to keep building going. This is the world of the late polis, the world of the post-polis, which is already the world of the medieval city at Butrint, or the economically vibrant early Arab city, the Abbasid city, after the Arab conquest of certain parts where urbanism had continued very strongly, and indeed underwent a boom, especially in Syria. So that's a history of the polis, 800 BC to AD 600. That was the easy part. across this narrative, are there any essential characteristics of the polis that emerge, back to Priene, that distinguish it from other cities or city-states across history? I want to single out 5 interrelated features across this history. First, the polis is based on the communal embedding of elites within communities. Eliteness is defined by the community and comes with obligations. Second, this embedding and these obligations are part of a wider set of ethical values: communitarianism, egalitarianism, restraint, and a proclaimed belief in social justice as a center for shared lives. Third, the polis distinguishes very sharply between private and public, both as a guarantee of private property and individual rights as opposed to feudal or tributary states, and as a guarantee of the existence of public goods, abstract or concrete. Fourth, the polis is organized as a state with autonomous institutions, but along specific lines. Power rests in the sovereign popular assembly. The executive power is limited and accountable. The state is ideologically primary to individuals, but is practically thin and conceived of as immediately equivalent to the sum of the members of to koinon. For instance, public debt or public windfalls are considered as a sum of individual liabilities or shares. Various public traits fit within this context, for instance, the importance of public speech or of publicity, especially through inscriptions, i.e. permanent public writing. Fifth, the polis is a political and human community of citizens sharing place. The consequence is that each polis feels very special and very different from other polis, defines itself against other polis in conflictual terms, but also polis can relate to each other in networks of collaboration and contact. This explains the remarkable unity of the polis phenomenon across the board, and change just occurs, it seems, at a uniform pace. This polis then can be studied as a unitary phenomenon under many angles. It can be considered as part of political philosophy because of its proclaimed concern with justice and power, with ethical behavior, within common norms, and with the educative force of political practice, and with the good life. This is a polis of Hannah Arendt. The choice is not, in fact, anachronistic. It's written out of the polis's language itself. The language of the Hellenistic decrees shows that one of the paths that 4th century philosophy took was the applied virtue ethics of the Hellenistic polis. The polis can also be studied under the heading of political science as a bundle of institutional choices and incentives put in place by historical actors within political processes and leading to certain outcomes. This is an approach with a hard statistical and numerate edge rather than the study of value enactment and civic ideology, the approach that probably has dominated the study of the polis up to now. As an aside, Josh reminds me to remind you that tomorrow Henry Farrell is presenting a paper applying evolutionary theory to institutional change, with much discussion of the Athenian test case at the Linda Randall Meyer Research Workshop in the program for Global Justice at 1:15 p.m. I close my, resume normal service now. The polis can also be studied as part of urban history. The mission here is going to be to rescue the polis from being studied as an abstract entity. The polis also existed as a set of spaces. Such a study must rise above the mere cataloguing of buildings and amenities on the classical side, and it has to rescue the polis from being the first well-meaning preface to a general study of the urban phenomenon on the geography side of this approach. Finally, the polis is not just an isolated agglomeration, it exists in a landscape. Every city has to exist or existed in its site. As the French historian and epigraphist Louis Robert proclaimed, the polis should be studied in its Mediterranean context. And anyone who guesses where this is can come see me afterwards for a bottle of champagne. We have to think in terms of classical topography. Why are polis located where they are? Does the mountainous terrain favor the division of landscape into micropolities, is one of the classic old chestnuts of this. We should think about ecology. Is a polis the product of Mediterranean conditions of scarcity and interconnectedness, of harshness and opportunity, of honor and memory and oppression? Or is a polis a reaction to these conditions? As the historian Ernst Kirsten wrote, a student of the great Alfred Philippson, the polis is a problem of Mediterranean history. All of these approaches then have to be woven, it's not the slide I want, woven to answer the simple question, why the polis? The question can be made to fan out into a whole series of causal questions, which are implied in my narrative story of the polis as given above. Why did the polis arise? Why the shift from pre-polis to polis with the end of aristocracy, the emergence of elites? Why did the polis, after the processes of archaic experiment, take this particular Aristotelian form, which I've given you very coarsely and in a very, very broad brush sort of way? Why did the polis continue into the Roman period? How and why did it transform around that watershed of AD 400? Why do the elites disengage at that moment? We could collapse these questions back into the original question and perhaps transform it. What is the polis good for? One answer is to view the polis in terms of success in a Darwinian model of explanation, indebted to new institutionalism. The polis emerges out of a process of whatever, struggle, conflict, aristocratic self-regulation, and develops and persists because it's good at existing and reproducing and spreading, but also good at solving problems, at protecting liberty and agency, at ensuring dignity and the good life. The polis is good at organizing resources and people to resist external pressure militarily or through processes of negotiation. Internally, the polis tries to prevent the tragedy of the commons, the free rider problem, the sucker's payoff by collective action. This is clearly seen in a decree passed by the citizens of a tiny island, the tiny polis, the island polis of Heraclea in the Cyclades, whose citizens swore a solemn oath by Heracles not to keep goats. The prohibition here is not about religion, but about the prevention of community suicide in terms of political ecology. This tiny island, with its one spring, can either sustain a population of goats and a few herders producing animal protein for an absentee landlord. It can be the island of the Cyclops, or it can sustain a human community of citizens who are willing to try to live together and protect the basis for their common life by collective action. This is a bundle of issues the ancients are explicitly aware of. For instance, in classical Athenian comedy, these problems are really thought about very hard. The next step might be to elaborate a version of the polis as killer app. Whatever a killer app is, I'm sorry. To use, I believe, the metaphor prone by Niall Ferguson. The constitutive features of the killer app are an egalitarian culture, including institutionalized limits on the power of the rich and redistributive gestures, full empowerment and entitlement for a group of privileged citizens, a limited but absolute context for altruism in the form of the shared identity of the polis, a strong public sphere. In this model, the polis constitutes a world within which such features as private property, the rule of law, and information sharing can reach their full potential. As Herodotus wrote of the highly successful Athens after the Cleisthenes reform, political equality, iseg or rie, is a good thing, not in one respect, but overall. While the Athenians were oppressed under a tyranny, they were, as men working for a master, cowardly. But when they were freed, each one was eager to achieve for himself, individual incentives leading to aggregate achievement. The polis creates this context of trust and low transaction costs, but also of agency. The polis is good for health, it's good for wealth, It's good for business. It's good for growth. The rich submit to all of these practices, redistribution and so on, and egalitarian practices, because they understood it's good for everyone. The polis's success at these and many other things explains the attractiveness of the polis model and the very important phenomenon in Greek history of the spread of the polis meme. In Lycia, the dynastic culture of palaces and country aristocrats is replaced, starting in the 4th century, with a polis culture combining urban democracy with integrated rural settlements, and the full polis package of euergetism, priests, institutions, and civic culture. Non-Greeks want in. The polis is one of the motors of Hellenization. Non-Greek cities become polis, with polis institutions and participation in a network of polis. Anatolian villages adopt polis-style institutions, which allow them to interact with and constrain their landlords and regulate their internal lives on polis lines. This is one model of the polis. It's the Goldilocks model. The polis maintains a just right balance. The polis sounds like a convenient foreshadowing of Glaser, Richard Wilkinson, and Tony Judt. Is it perhaps a little too good to be true? Should we be thinking of rescuing the Greeks not from our condescension, to use E.P. Thompson's dictum, but from our love? I want to offer you two possibilities for the reading of the polis against the grain. The polis of conflict and breakdown, the polis of exploitation and rule. First then, the bad polis, the polis of conflict, the divided polis. The Goldilocks fallacy might hide the contradictory nature of the polis, starting with the paradoxical nature of the central trope of elitism decided by community. The polis is not a liberal society where there exists a central core of agreed values as a basis for debate and disagreement. The communitarian assumptions of total investment combined with aristocratic legacies of competitiveness ensure that political debate leads to radical explosive politics, especially in the frequent case of outside pressure willing to exploit internal dissension, very frequent situation during the long classical period. This is an understanding of the polis as paradoxically prone to constant crisis because of its essential insistence on unity. This is a major contribution made by Nicole Laureau, the scholar of Athens and the polis, in her last work. It's powerfully exploited in the forthcoming work of Benjamin Gray at All Souls College in Oxford. On this view, the polis is not an evolutionary outcome, but a messy historical compromise in a state of near constant crisis. Here's another way in which the polis is not a liberal ideal. It is the polis of rule. H.M. Jones, in his classic Greek City from Alexander to Justinian, condemned the city as a failure, notably to spread wealth and culture beyond the narrow circle of citizens. On this view, the polis and its culture is an institutional form of exclusion and of exploitation. Where is exploitation located in the polis? I will propose 4 loci of injustice. First, of course, the polis is a slave society with all that entails in terms of social violence and cruelty. It is important not to brush this point away by stating that most ancient societies were slave-based anyway, and that the polis better than most, and that the lower levels of production are not what matters, only upper-level polities. The central foundational principle of the polis is full entitlement of all citizens to political rights. In other words, to rule. The consequence of the obsession with rule is that fitness to be a citizen is defined in opposition to other rulable groups, women and slaves, whose labor supports the empowering and meaningful political work of citizenship. This analysis, the Finlay paradox, is in fact explicitly given by Aristotle, who's not at all bothered by it. Second, exploitation can take the form of exploitation of the collective extraction of surplus from producers in the form of imperialism, as in the case of Athens, or of micro-imperialism in the case of just about anyone else, in fact. Micro-imperialism being a term we owe to Michel Austin and Pierre Vidal-Naquet. I won't talk about it too long. Thirdly, citizens could be sustained by the labor and the work of whole dependent groups, most famously in Sparta, where a small citizen elite was supported by the work of a serf class, or indeed in Priene. Priene as a town does not seem to have had any space set aside for the economic. The city, to a certain extent, lived off its agricultural territory occupied by the villages of the plainsmen, some kind of non-citizen, probably non-Greek serf population, a community slave population which rose in rebellion, and a population which was exploited by the city for whichever king ruled the area on the condition of taking a cut of the taxation. These forms of exploitation are also consequences of the obsession with rule. Finally, and fourthly, we should consider the possibility that exploitation could take place within the citizen body, between town and country, between rich and poor, and that civic ideologies and gestures serve to legitimate inequalities and injustice. The political culture, the ideological, the redistributive, and the communitarian might have functioned to allow the wealthy to enjoy the product of their private property, accumulated through rents, money lending, and speculation on foodstuffs. This may have been the processes at work in the Roman era polis, where many scholars have suggested harsh class realities behind the civic ideology. Did a similar situation hold true for the Aristotelian polis? Notice the granularity in this picture. The Aristotelian polis, or the Archaic period. Polis equality, like the uniformity of the modern suburb, might be the result of processes of exclusion and exploitation which are not immediately legible. Classical democracy might have been part of the class struggle in the ancient world, but not quite in the way in which Geoffroy de Sainte Croix had hoped. The rich might have submitted to egalitarianism not because of cultural or moral or utilitarian imperatives, but either because they already controlled the game or in order to control the game by legitimating elite rule or by pursuing contingent and structural advantages. So the polis is associated with rule. It served the Macedonian kings to rule over the subject population of Macedonia. It served the kings to rule over the conquered lands of the east. It served the Roman state to exploit the countryside, the shares to be divided between the empire and the urban elites. In this respect, does the polis look different from the Mediterranean city of later ages and indeed all ages? Does it look different? Does the polis look different from the late Ottoman city of the Agars, the land-owning class living the life of luxury financed by exploiting the despised countryside? On this model, we see a polis as historical product of a class of landed gentlemen consolidating and institutionalizing their position within communities to sustain their lifestyles and their acquisitiveness. This is a model which, for instance, Hans van Wees has vigorously promoted for the Archaic period. In this lecture, I've offered a bird's eye narrative of the polis from beginning to end with some new periodizing. It's in itself an effect of the 30,000 feet perspective, perspective that allows, for instance, the death of oligarchy or the emergence of euergetism to work itself out in time. The payoff is a definition of a few characteristics: embedded elites, public sphere, public finance, and democracy. It also shows the unstable nature of the elements. Instead of a steady directional development, a swirl of possibilities. The payoff was two possible analyses. On the one hand, an institutional analysis of the polis as killer app. On the other, a radical analysis of the polis as aptly named killer app, only in as much as its killerness is based on exploitation. If the first analysis is correct, we study the polis as an exhilarating historical example that proves that social justice ensures moral outcomes, but also works. If the second analysis is correct, we study the polis as a historical example of processes of conflict, negotiation, and exploitation, and as a cautious exercise in reading norms and ideologies in contexts of struggle, even when not apparent. This, I predict, is the next battlefield in the study of the polis, and perhaps of ancient history in general. Can I have some water at this point? I think this is a rather good time to drink. So, the next battlefield, or perhaps not. I've made all this up, of course. All of this is very tentative. It's a lot more complicated than this. There's a lot more to consider. Religion, gender, and the polis as part of world history. That's funny. Of world history. There's a curiously fraught business. Most importantly, these two polis, the Goldilocks city and the Città dolente, the city of pain, have been with us for a very long time, well beyond the current horizons of the 1960s and 70s structuralism and 1980s critical approaches and the recent new economic history. Any historiography of the polis is about the two polis, the good polis and the bad polis. For what it's worth, my own view is that long history of the polis shows what it's good at, avoiding the tragedy of the commons. It also shows the brittleness of the polis and shows that this brittleness problematizes any easy celebration of success, as well as draws our attention to problems of power and exploitation. Finally, we should be aware of the issues of diversity. The megapolis of classical Athens may have been based on exploitation, but it's more difficult to locate in the case of the hoe and terrace agrarian small island polities like Heraclea. The uniform polis package might have worked itself out in different forms, according to size, geography, and history. And things changed. The Praenians integrated the non-citizens, the paroikoi, those who dwell alongside within their civic life. These are the plainsmen. These are the serf class who gradually worked their way into the polis. Polis realities might have been a lot gentler and more humane than the strictly exclusive ideologies. And this also tells us something about the nature of the polis. The case of Priene invites us to emphasize this civilizing and socializing impact. And I don't think, in the end, that the polis was the city of the Argars lording it over the despised countryside. The polis was a city of reason, as Oswin Murray wrote, but it also was a city of desire, the political desire for community and justice. And this effect can still be measured. The rediscovery of Plutarch and his polis sensibilities, the exploration of classical, the exploration of classical lands, the study of Greek art produced by city-states, the study of inscriptions, there you are, which showed that such a world of small, self-running polities had existed and had worked. All of these cultural phenomena, starting in the modern period, early modern period, into our time, has had a profound impact on the development of modern Western culture and the modern Western nation state. It's visible in the work of Auguste Boeck, or of Fustel de Coulanges, or in Volney's great meditation on ruins, on the way in which classical ruins invite you to republicanism. This sympathetic appropriation of the polis says something not just about us, but also about the humane potential of the polis itself. The last 15 minutes or so, I have the feeling I've been sticking my neck out and sticking my head in the lion's jaws and bringing it out again, and ducking and weaving for too long. So it's time for me to end. I apologize for overrunning, and thank you very much for your patience and your attention.
We owe thanks to John for a wonderful, exhilarating roller coaster ride through 1400 years, ending in crucial questions for us as zoa politica, political animals. And I'm also happy to see that even in a few days you've picked up the lingo of Silicon Valley. And so I'm not sure this is a killer lecture or a killer app lecture, perhaps, but it certainly shows us a superb historian thinking totally out of the box. So thanks once again.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.